Ukraine would not be admitted into NATO until it had prevailed in the conflict. In other words, Ukraine has to win the war before it can be brought into the alliance. Well, Ukraine is not going to win the war, and therefore Ukraine is not going to be brought into the alliance. This war is going to go on for a long time. Even if you get a cold peace, it will linger right below the surface, and there will be an ever-present danger that a hot war will break out. And in those circumstances, I find it hard to imagine United States or any West European country agreeing to bring Ukraine into NATO. And the simple reason is that if you bring Ukraine into NATO in the midst of a conflict, you are in effect committing NATO to defending with military force Ukraine on the battlefield. And that's a situation we don't want. We do not want NATO boots on the ground, or to be more specific, we don't want American boots on the ground. So it makes perfect sense for Stoltenberg to say that Ukraine has to win. In effect, Ukraine has to win a decisive victory over the Russians within the borders of Ukraine. That is not going to happen, in my opinion, and therefore, as you were saying, Ukraine is not going to become part of NATO. You can't underestimate just how foolish the West is when it comes to the whole question of Ukraine and all sorts of other issues as well. But I think that the West believed, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, that if a war did break out between Ukraine and Russia, that the West plus Ukraine would prevail, that the Russians would be defeated. I believe we thought that was the case. If you look at the run up to the war in early 2022, what's really striking to me is that it was quite clear that war was at least a serious possibility. Yet the United States and the West more generally did virtually nothing to prevent the war. If anything, we egged the Russians on. And I find this hard to imagine what was going on here. And I think that we believed that if a war broke out, we had trained up the Ukrainians and armed the Ukrainians up enough that they would hold their own on the battlefield, number one. And number two, I think we felt the magic weapon was sanctions, that we'd finish the Russians off with sanctions. And the Ukrainians would end up defeating the Russians, and they would then be in a position where we could admit them into NATO. That is what I think is going on.